I'm a GP by background. I work in Coventry and Warwickshire and an associate medical director for NHS Midlands. And I'm joined today by some fabulous colleagues from nursing, like Fiona, and I've got an FMLM fellow, Rebecca Rhodes here, loads of ESIST colleagues as well. And we've all been working to think kind of what in the 100-day discharge challenge, what did treating delayed discharge as a harm really mean? We've also sort of co-working with Fiona with Recondition the Nation, where there's loads of really good work going on in that space as well. And so we wanted to give the opportunity for a few drop-in sessions where people could bring problems if you've got them, or share really good experiences of where things have worked well. We've got some brilliant people here from ESIST. So we've got Ben Owens here from Sherwood Forest, Ned Hobbs from Walsall, we've got Bareth, and we've got Richard Jennifer as well, and both of those geriatricians been doing loads of great work. If all of you wouldn't mind introducing yourselves in the chat box, and then as you talk as well, if you introduce yourselves, that would be really, really helpful. I'm going to start by introducing Ned Hobbs, who has made a real cultural impact on his trust by doing some measurement around harm. And Ned, I think the best thing is for you to explain what you've done, and then we can take some questions from there.
Thanks, Imogen, and afternoon, everyone. So really grateful for the chance just to briefly share sort of the approach that we've taken in Walsall over the last few years. I joined the Trust in 2019, and for those that are less familiar with Walsall, we're a small to medium-sized district general hospital and combined community trust. And when I joined, I think it was fair to say that most of the language associated with emergency care and the safe and timely flow of patients through emergency care pathways was not geared around harm. It was geared around phrases such as breaches, phrases such as how many patients are waiting, more sort of traditional managerial language. And actually one of the things that we decided to do fairly early on, so it was early in 2020, just before COVID hit, was undertake our own internal analysis between the duration of time that patients spend in the emergency department and some headline outcome indicators. And important to note, this was before Chris Moulton and colleagues published their research and before the National Emergency Medicine Getting It Right First Time report that covered similar analysis. So we took 3 years worth of emergency admissions from the emergency department into the trust and looked to assess the correlation between the duration of time the patient waited in ED prior to admission and their likelihood of mortality and their inpatient length of stay. And what this showed with our own patients and our own data is that, broadly speaking, the risk of mortality rose with each additional hour in the emergency department by approximately 0.75%. We cut this a lot of different ways. So we excluded children, we excluded same-day emergency care patients, we cut it by admitting speciality. But in every case, the pattern was the same, that the longer you wait for admission, the higher, unfortunately, the chance of in-hospital mortality and the longer length of stay for patients following admission. And what this allowed us to do was I think, to change the narrative around the UEC pathway to a language of risk of harm and evidence of harm, rather than the way things may previously have been described. And it also, I think, enabled us to focus the attention particularly of specialties outside of emergency medicine. I mean, I think ED colleagues have probably known this for years, even before published research in the UK was made. But I think it drew the attention of colleagues in, the big admitting specialties, acute medicine, general surgery, trauma and orthopedics, and so on, that actually if patients are delayed getting into the right specialty, their outcomes are likely to be worse. We've then used it as part of business cases, so business cases to expand our same-day emergency care unit, cite this evidence. We've used it for expansion in things like access to inpatient radiology to shorten length of stay and improve emergency access. And we've used it importantly to expand the functional hours of our discharge lounge, particularly in recognition that for one patient that moves to the discharge lounge, typically 4 or 5 patients ultimately benefit from reduced harm. The one moving to the lounge who can get home in a more comfortable environment, the one that can then get admitted from an assessment unit to an inpatient bed, the patient that can be admitted from ED to an assessment unit, and the patient that can get off an ambulance into ED, and the patient at home that the ambulance is then released to go out and tend to, who's called 999 in the community. And in lots of correspondence within the trust, lots of, as I say, formal business cases that have ultimately received approved investment, this measurement of harm has been, I think, an important part of that argument. It doesn't mean we've cracked it by any stretch. There's lots of parts of the UEC pathway that we need to improve, and indeed there's sort of pockets of staff that I think still perhaps don't fully comprehend the risk of harm to delayed discharges and delayed emergency admissions, but I do think it's helped contribute to a different mindset. And most recently, we've extended our analysis to link the data set from our colleagues at West Midlands Ambulance Service with our in-hospital data sets for all 4 Black Country trusts. And what that's been trying to explore is the relationship between pre-hospital delay in the ambulance pathway and in-hospital mortality. And that's been less easily able to be clearly evidenced, and we're still working through a few different statistical models on this. But again, it's the principle of being able to describe challenges in the pathway in terms of risk of harm, rather than solely in terms of breaches to waiting time standards or ambulance category response time standards, etc. So that's, I guess, a sort of whistle-stop overview. Imogen, very happy to sort of expand on different parts of what we've done, and I'll hand back to you for any questions that there might be.
Thanks, Ned. I'm going to kick off with a question while I get others to put up hands, if that's okay. One of the things I have heard is that, we need to have it bottom-up change as well as top-down. But how did you get people in senior management and senior leadership positions on board with your idea of this measurement and that this was the way to go?
Good question. So the initial analysis in terms of delayed admission harm from ED was co-sponsored by myself and the medical director, and it was us who presented to the wider executive team. It had our names on when it was getting shared, for example, with our senior medical staffing body, our clinical directors, our divisional directors, and so forth. So it was clinically and operationally jointly led, and I think I remember at the time there being lots of questions of sort of slight skepticism. The question would come back, oh, it's skewed because the children get admitted more quickly. That's why it's lower mortality rates for short wait times in ED. So we excluded children and the pattern was the same. Or it's skewed because patients don't wait as long to be admitted through to SDEP units. That's why the pattern's like that. We excluded SDEP units, the pattern was exactly the same. So we were able to almost take challenge from the clinical body of the analysis and then refine it to address those questions. And ultimately, as I say, the pattern is consistent across the specialities, and even when you've adjusted for ages or SDEC and so forth. I think what we always also said is that ours was not a statistically significant analysis as Chris Moulton and colleagues' work. So we didn't suggest causality. We just evidenced an association between delays and harm, and we're at pains to stress that. Obviously, within a few months, UK literature has been published that probably far more strongly evidences causality in a statistically significant way, and that's helped obviously to reinforce the message internally that we've had. But co-sponsorship from medical leadership and operational leadership, I think, is key, Imogen.
Thanks, Ned. A few people have put some questions in the chat, which I'm going to try and bring out. So one of them has asked a bit more, if you were able to share a bit more information about how you've really got the discharge lounge to work, because they're saying that it's often underutilised in their hospitals.
Yeah, so I think Nick very kindly has just posted the link. We did an eCyst video podcast on this a couple of months ago, and probably that will have far more detail than I can cover in sort of a minute or two. But what was really evident to us, as is the case in the vast majority, I think, of acute hospitals, is that it isn't necessarily the total number of discharges that is the issue per day. It's often the time that patients leave an inpatient bed not matching the pattern of demand for new admissions from the emergency department. And we recognise that supporting a properly skilled and functioning discharge lounge would allow patients that are leaving the hospital to vacate the inpatient ward much earlier in the day and then release that flow earlier in the day as a result. So we piloted the hours last winter. We extended to 7 a.m. till 10 p.m. We've got registered nurses with, in effect, acute nursing skills, so we can deliver final treatments like, Ferinject or other treatments don't have to be done on the ward. We've got a proper ring-fence location. We never ever bed inpatients overnight in the discharge lounge. We protect the space to have the benefit the following morning. And we've measured it. So we've been able to evidence, we've doubled the number of patients that are discharged via the lounge. And probably most importantly, we're generally freeing up about 25% of our discharges. We're freeing up the inpatient ward bed before midday, and that's ultimately what supports flow through our assessment units and ED. So there's lots more probably to it that the podcast will show, but I think this evidence of how the discharge lounge can contribute to reducing the harm of delayed admission was part of the reason that the business case was approved.
I'm getting a few questions that I wanted to bring to a wider group of you than just you, Ned, because it's a question about how you might record or measure harms related to delayed discharge. So sort of, I guess, measuring at the other end of the pathway. I wondered if anyone's got anything to share around that. And I know that I've got colleagues from ECYST online, whether they've got any examples to bring out. One thing I can share is I know Northamptonshire is beginning to look into that, and I don't know if they're here on the journey, but if I wanted to bring them in if they were. But other than that, yeah, if there's anyone else that wants to jump in at that point. I'm not seeing any hands. I will go on to explain a bit about what Northamptonshire are trying. Oh, Richard, you're going to jump in. You go first.
Yeah, so I think having data at your fingertips that you can use in discussions about weighing up risk is really helpful. So the data that Ned has gathered, I think is really valuable. A very simple thing that you can do, and that I've done, is you can look at somewhere like Dr. Foster, and you can look at mortality for inpatients, either at a number of trusts or just at your own trust, and you can break it down by length of stay. And so if you do that, so if you look at all non-specialist acute trusts in England, and you look at mortality for over 75-year-olds who are in hospital for 2 weeks or longer, that figure is 13.3%. And so when you hear a statistic like that, the first thing to do is to sort of ask yourself, is that a big number or not? And so to give you sort of a point of reference, the percentage of British soldiers who died in the First World War was 12.5%. So if you're 75 years old and you're in hospital for 2 weeks or longer, So not all that long, your risk of not surviving that admission is greater than the chance of a First World War British soldier not surviving the war. So give you an idea of the kind of situation we are sort of trying to improve. And just as Ned pointed out, you know, we can't draw an absolute causative link between those two things, but there is a correlation, and that correlation is something to explore. And you know, and we will all have come across people who were at some point in their hospital journey were medically stable at one point, and who do not survive to discharge. And it's about trying to look at things we can do to prevent the preventable deaths from happening. So I think that's another useful thing at the other end, if you like, to that there is a real connection to think about between those people in hospital a long time. The other thing to remember as well is these people's time is so valuable. So if there was a study done in Scotland where they looked at the outcomes of people admitted under medical teams who were various ages, but for those aged 85 and older, 42% of them weren't alive in a year. So, you know, we forget about the last 1,000 days. These are people who are approaching their last Christmas. Is another way to sort of think about it. I'll step out now because I see Nick's got his hand up.
Nick, please join us. You're on mute.
Schoolboy error. How long have we been doing this for now? So I was just thinking, as Richard was talking there, maybe this goes back towards back further up the pathway into ED and back into the community. So I might just bring Ben and Barath into this. We think about delays and we think about the associated harms as a result of those delays, but we may develop some assumptions about the causes of those delays, and I think that we recognise there are significant delays around social care and community access, but that's not everything. We know that's not everything. We know there are still many internal delays as well that we can affect internally within the hospitals. I just wonder whether I know Richard and Ben have developed the inpatient decision support tool around supporting timelier, quicker discharge. But just going to throw over to Ben and Barath. Any thoughts around, just we often look at the back door and all the delays around the back door, but what's the impact of delayed discharge further up the pathway?
Come in, Nick. I think yes. I think there's always the way I always look at this. If it's the same for admissions. So if someone is either delayed by a day in hospital or hours in hospital, or someone gets admitted who didn't need admitting, then actually there are 4 people at very best have a poor experience, and at worst suffer harm, and a small number would die. Is actually the person who's in hospital, we just talked about the delayed discharge, the person who's in the ED who can't get into hospital. We know if you spend more than 8 hours in an ED, approximately Chris Morton's work, that 1 in 80, every 80 patients, 1 extra death occurs. And we know that for people who stay in ambulance for protracted time outside an ED, and that's the next who can't get into the ED, we know about 9% suffer harm now. And of course, the one in the community is getting no care at all. And we know very well cardiac arrest survival rates is 10% if in community. If you get to hospital, it'll be 100% if you don't get to hospital. Stroke thrombolysis, all those other things that we know are time critical are delayed. So there are 4 harms and in these scenarios actually. So what can we measure around it? I think I look at, don't measure time. If you want to see the issues in the system, I wouldn't look at like neck of femur, time to theatre. It's time to theatre from the incident, not time of theatre of when they get to the ward. So actually, if they fall in the community and they're stuck in the floor for 8 hours, then actually the time to theatre is not from when they got to your ED or when they got to your ward. It's the time that they fell in the community, because that's a knock-on effect of all these delays. You can look at that as part of it. So look at the pre-hospital time rather than just it's not the time of ambulance, it's the time of the call. To look at that delays here, and you'll see the real delays in your system. In terms of picking up delays in your system, you can do something about the tool that Nick references. There's an admission decision support tool looking at bed debt, and part of that is capturing bed days lost. But also, if you do an audit on it, there's an inpatient tool as well about discharge. Actually, it's the tool designed to pick up we look at delays lost where a patient could potentially have gone home. And actually, if you look at those bed days lost from one admission or 1 day's worth of admissions, it can be quite numerous. And that's another way of doing it, is to use these tools and to capture bed days lost, which is lost to the patient's time, but actually we know if they're in hospital, there's 4 people harmed by that, and so extrapolate that is a good way of doing it. But Brath can probably come in on the community side as well.
Hey, thanks, Ben. I think Imogen, I should have jumped in at the Northamptonshire, but sorry about that. It took me a few seconds. I think lunch not being there is an issue. There's 2 aspects which really worries us, because a frail elderly patient coming in, they make up not around about 30 to 40%, but the ones staying in the hospital are nearly 80 to 85%. So for us, what we looked at is, as Imogen said, measuring. We knew there was a few things going on with these patients. That means most of them are coming with immobility, and what we're seeing was falls. So what we said was that the NEWS 2 doesn't allow us to do anything for that one. So we introduced something which is called as the orthostatic hypotension check on every patient. Following that one, what we did was we said, how do we know patients are getting it? So we made sure that every patient getting a visit from a rapid response or intermediate care team person gets a physical check, which is a observation check, a NEWS 2. So we did quality improvement on that one. What we found was around about 4,800 visits per month. Around 4,600 of them get a NEWS 2 visit, and then they got completion of nearly 99.1% of the NEWS 2. But what we found from that was the readmissions into hospital. What we know from the data nationally, internationally, is 35 to 50% of the patients coming out of an A&E, MAU, or a care of the elderly ward can get admitted in the next 12 months. And when looked at our data, what we found, so the measurements was ours was around about 9 to 11%. So and then when we looked at the admissions of these patients, we only found the ones getting admitted, the ones are new sudden events or red flag events, and the ones which are getting admitted, the NEWS 2 of 3 plus in one category or 5 plus in another. But with the variance, we do have palliative care patients. So the variance was discounted. That means patients that didn't need end of life. So I think measuring to achieve an outcome is great, but also what it does for us is these are the same patients we were getting from acute hospital after a stay of deconditioning, falls, or some chest infections, or so we do the curb score for pneumonia as well. And if they meet the criteria, they have to go in. And then if they meet the criteria to admit as well, they go in. So I think there are 2 elements which we need to be clear about is everybody's at risk when they get into the hospital. But if we can minimize the risk by measuring review of the patient or calculating what the outcomes for will help us out. What that helps us out as well is trying to refocus the energy of the local systems as well. That means primary care able to refer with the right kind of patients rather than utilizing the capacity and going saying this patient's too ill to be in the community. But when we do that and then communicate, that will be really helpful in the whole process. And then Ben and Richard's guide in the front and reason to admit, that can come and help for these patients that don't need to get admitted. That's kind of a way to decreasing and harm and measuring harm, which we are supporting these patients in the community. That's just an example. The other bit, what we found was access to some senior decision making. That means just a telephone call. Most of the clinicians in the community are able to work independently, but they just need some kind of a support saying what they're doing is right. Could be GP talking to a consultant, paramedic talking to a matron or consultant or a GP. So those pathways, when they get strengthened, you then start seeing risk-taking ability to be performed in the correct way. That means they're taking the risk for the right reasons rather than not knowing what they're doing and then just sending them in, which helps them to meet the criteria to admit and also decrease the length of stay in total. So getting access to somebody and also looking at each patient on your books will greatly help in the further decreasing in harm when they get admitted.
Thank you so much for those insights. I just wanted to highlight a few things in the chat. One is that there is a Future NHS page that's been created that has got a lot of resources on it to help with this conversation further. And also, I know that ESIST are always willing to support those wanting to do work in this space. So if anyone wants to reach out to anyone that's here on this call, I'm sure people are happy to support. And I've also popped in the chat a Menti survey, which would be super helpful in terms of people filling in. And if you want to use this, the one sort of open-ended question, any thoughts on how we can support further, anything you want to cover in the future, please put that in. And I wanted to bring out one point that Ben popped in the chat around measuring for positivity. And Ben, I didn't know if you wanted to explain that a little bit, because I think that's a really key point as well.
Yeah, and it's a bit like Ned's thing about the positive help four people. Negative comments can make either staff feel demoralised, or if you measure falls only, people are mobilised less. The evidence is, and you treat falls as a harm event. Well, actually, if you measure falls, but you measure mobilisation or percentage of patients sitting out, or other positive things like the number of patients discharged to their previous level of care, to their own environment. They're all things that patients ever would all strive for. And actually, if you measure those things, then staff are more likely to do them. And particularly, staff can feel criticised for negative things like falls, and actually, but we don't celebrate positive things enough. So by measuring positive things and celebrating positive things, you can drive positive behaviours and things like asking patients what matters to them the most, and actually getting that written on the wall above the patient's bed and things like that. They're all positive things that encourage positive conversation with patients, and that can only encourage staff to do the right thing. We're quite scared of litigation or being in trouble or complaints, and if you only measure those negative things, our natural tendency in life is to go, okay, I'm going to back away from that and not do that. But there's really good evidence. I think with Northern Care Alliance managed to say, by measuring mobilisation or sitting out by midday, managed to take quite a bit off length of stay doing that.
I think that's really helpful. I'm really sorry that the Menti's not working. I will try and figure that out and put it in the chat for afterwards. But equally, if you have any feedback and you want to just email me directly, I've whacked my email address in there. There's always a technology fail in these moments. Thank you so much for everyone joining today. I've really appreciated it. We wanted just to whet the appetite, I guess, around this subject, show that lots is going out there, and people are trying stuff. And I think we all want to say, just have a go. Like, there are real harms happening to patients at the moment, and I see that every day when I am seeing patients in general practice, and I think anything you can do will be fantastic, and if we can support in any way, please let us know. I wanted to highlight that Fiona is running a drop-in around Recondition the Nation on Thursday, so please do join that if that is of interest, and we will have our next one of these on the 11th of January, which is around more about the sort of cultural revolution of how do you get your clinicians on board with this message. You know, things like by discharging somebody a little bit earlier in the day, you're actually impacting on 5 patients, the kind of positive messaging around that. So there'll be one on that, and then there's one following that will be about so once you've got them on board, what next? How do you get them on board? What sort of things are people doing? So yeah, thank you very much. Is there anything anyone wanted to add? Any AOB? That's great. Go and have some lunch and a cup of tea, and thank you for all the work you're doing around this space, because I know it's not easy.
Thank you.
Thanks all.